There are 195 countries on Earth. 10 of them control half the world's oil, and they all sit in the same corner of the same map. Millions of people died last century fighting over that corner. The reason was decided 150 million years before the first bullet was fired. When Saudi Arabia was forced to open its books in 2019 for the first time in nearly 40 years, the numbers inside shook every serious energy analyst on Earth. What those documents revealed about the world's most important oil field, and what they implied about how long any of this actually lasts, has never properly landed in public. Watch this through to the end, because the number buried in that filing changes everything that comes after it. The drill bit cracked limestone at 4,727.7 feet on March 3, 1938. Eastern Saudi Arabia, a site called Dammam Dome No. 7. The American geologists working that rig had been drilling the same location for years with nothing to show for it. 6 dry wells before this one. The 7th was days from being shut down when the limestone broke open and oil started climbing the pipe on its own. Nobody standing on that desert floor understood the scale of what they'd just punctured. That came later, well by well, decade by decade, along with a question that runs underneath every war, every embargo, and every price spike of the century that followed. Why here, and how much is actually left? Go back 150 million years. The land that is now Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran wasn't planned. It was a warm, shallow sea called the Tethys Ocean, packed with microscopic life. Trillions of tiny creatures, algae, plankton, the shells of animals too small to see, lived and died in that water every single day for millions of years. When they sank to the seafloor, something unusual kicked in. The floor of the Tethys was low in oxygen and sealed off from the currents above. Without oxygen, the dead material couldn't break down normally. It piled up instead, layer after layer, pressed deeper by the weight of everything accumulating on top, mixing with carbonate, sediment, and clay. Then tens of millions of years of heat and pressure went to work. That organic material cooked slowly at what geologists call the oil window, a temperature band between roughly 60 and 120 degrees Celsius, where organic matter turns into liquid petroleum. The Tethys sediments hit that window almost perfectly across an enormous area and stayed there long enough to generate oil at a scale the rest of the planet's geology simply didn't match. The richness of the source rock, the thickness of the layers, the length of time they spent cooking. It all lined up in a way that geologists have been searching for elsewhere ever since and haven't found. But generating the oil was only half of it. Lots of ancient sea basins around the world went through similar processes. What made the Middle East different was what happened next, the structure to trap what formed. Around 30 million years ago, the Arabian tectonic plates started pushing northeast into Eurasia. The two plates were closing on each other and the crust buckled under the pressure. That collision built the Zagros mountain range, a fold and thrust system running 1,600 kilometers from eastern Turkey down to the Strait of Hormuz. Mark Allen, a professor of earth sciences at Durham University, has called what that collision produced a geologist's dream. The folding bent the rock below into enormous arching shapes, dome structures and whale-backed folds, some of them kilometers wide and deep. Oil that had been slowly migrating upward through porous rock hit the roof of those arches and stopped dead. Layers of salt and dense shale sealed the top. The pressure held. The oil sat there in the dark, waiting. The rock it sat in made the economics almost unfair. Most of the reservoir rock under the Persian Gulf region is limestone, porous, fractured, and full of tiny channels that oil moves through easily. A barrel of oil in that limestone is already pressing toward the surface. Natural underground pressure does most of the work before any pump gets involved. In the earliest years of production in Kuwait and parts of Saudi Arabia, wells flowed to the surface with no mechanical help at all. Workers just opened a valve and stepped back. That physical fact, light crude, relatively shallow burial, naturally pressured limestone is what produces cost numbers that make every other major producing region on Earth look wasteful. Pulling a barrel of oil from the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia costs somewhere between $3 and $10. That figure held even through 2024, when production costs rose modestly but stayed among the lowest on Earth. Pulling that same barrel from North Dakota shale costs between $40 and $70. That gap isn't temporary. It doesn't close with better technology or more investment. It's geology. It doesn't move. Ghawar is where the abstraction becomes real. The field runs 280 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide through eastern Saudi Arabia. An underground geological structure roughly the area of Belgium, lying several kilometers below the desert, first drilled in 1948, confirmed as the world's largest conventional onshore oil field in 1957, it became the single most strategically important piece of energy infrastructure on Earth, and one of the most tightly guarded. The Saudi government treated its internal production data as a state secret for decades. The number that circulated in global energy markets, the assumption baked into forecasts and investment decisions around the world, was that Ghawar could pump more than 5 million barrels per day. That number was wrong. In April 2019, Saudi Aramco issued a bond on international debt markets. The offering required financial disclosures the company had never made public before. For the first time since the Saudi government nationalized its oil assets in the 1980s, field-level production data was visible to outside analysts. Ghawara's actual maximum sustainable output was 3.8 million barrels per day. Not 5 million. Not 5.5 million. The figure that energy markets had been using for nearly 20 years was off by more than 30%. The same filing explained how the field was still running at that level. To maintain underground pressure as oil is drawn out, Saudi Aramco had been injecting seawater into the Ghawar reservoir at roughly 7 million barrels per day. That's nearly double the oil extraction rate. The technique is called water flooding. It's standard practice on aging fields. You fill the space the oil leaves behind to keep pressure high enough to push remaining oil toward the production wells. Matthew Simmons, an energy investment banker who spent years reading the technical papers that Saudi petroleum engineers had presented at industry conferences, published a warning in 2005 that the scale of water injection at Ghawar pointed to a far more fragile production future than the kingdom admitted. He was widely dismissed. When the 2019 filing confirmed the water injection figures he'd long suspected, the dismissals got a lot quieter. That same filing had one more number that didn't get enough attention. By the end of 2018, Ghawar had produced a cumulative 85 billion barrels over its lifetime. Confirmed liquid reserves remaining in the field stood at 48 billion barrels. Saudi Arabia's confirmed national reserves sit at 267 billion barrels as of the most recent data, the second largest national total on Earth, behind Venezuela. Venezuela's reserves are almost entirely locked in the Orinoco Belt. Thick, heavy crude that's expensive to process and production collapsed. Saudi Arabia's reserves are light, accessible, and flowing. The kingdom pumped 9.5 million barrels per day through 2025. Iraq's engineers and the international oil companies working alongside them have been pulling around 4.4 million barrels per day from fields that hold 145 billion barrels of confirmed reserves. Most of Iraq's major producing fields are onshore and only partially developed. The country ranked second among all OPEC producers in output during 2024. Iran held 208 billion barrels of confirmed reserves and was producing above 4 million barrels per day before the regional military conflict that has disrupted its operations and choked movement through the Strait of Hormuz. Kuwait's reserve base at current production rates would outlast a century without a single new discovery. Put the four big Gulf producers together, and they hold a share of global oil that no other combination of countries touches. Ahmed Zaki Yamani understood what that concentration meant before almost anyone in the industrial world did. He served as Saudi Arabia's oil minister from 1962 through 1986, the man who translated geological advantage into political leverage. On October 16, 1973, Arab members of the oil exporters cartel sat down at the Sheraton Hotel in Kuwait City and announced they were raising the posted price of oil from around $3 a barrel to $5. Days later, after the United States authorized a large military resupply of Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the group went further. They cut production and placed a full export embargo on the United States, the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. American workers felt it before any policy response arrived. Gas station lines ran for blocks. Signs saying "Say out" were going up before noon. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns later said the oil weapon had arrived at the worst possible moment, when industrial capacity was already maxed out and there was no buffer left to absorb the hits. Unemployment climbed from 4.6% in October 1973 to 9% by May 1975. The US economy had grown 5.7% in 1973 and then shrank 0.5% the next year. Japan watched its economy grow at 8% in 1973 and shrink by 1.2% in 1974. The United Kingdom lost 3.9% of its output and spent 14 straight quarters trying to crawl back to where it had been. Germany, France, and the Netherlands each imposed emergency measures: Sunday driving bans, heating restrictions, lower speed limits. That would have seemed absurd to anyone living there the year before. The post-war boom, the era of cheap energy and permanent growth that had seemed like the natural state of the modern world, ended in a matter of weeks. What ended it wasn't a war, it wasn't a drought, it wasn't a discovery that changed the geology. It was a decision made in a hotel meeting room by ministers representing countries that happened to sit above the right kind of rock. Now go back to that 2019 filing. It disclosed more than just production capacity and water injection rates. The cumulative production figure, 85 billion barrels extracted through end of 2018, placed against Ghawar's original reserve estimate, tells a specific story. When Aramco engineers first appraised the field's recoverable reserves in the 1970s, the figure came in above 100 billion barrels. Production had already passed that number by the time the filing was released. The field is still running because improved technology and sustained water injection pushed recovery rates beyond what early models projected. But it's being held open by engineering now, not by the natural pressure that made it the cheapest oil source on Earth in its early decades. Saad Ibrahim al-Husseini, a former executive vice president at Saudi Aramco, gave the sharpest public warning about the broader reserve accounting problem. In diplomatic cables that became public through document release in 2011, al-Husseini warned that a figure of 716 billion barrels being cited at a regional conference was mixing unproven potential resources with actual proven reserves. His estimate of the overstatement of Saudi Arabia's proven reserves was around 300 billion barrels. That warning came from someone who had been one of the most senior technical people inside the Saudi oil system. It was noted and largely set aside. The official reserve numbers didn't change. The total that has circulated publicly since the 1980s has stayed essentially fixed, despite decades of continuous extraction. In any finite resource system, that math needs an explanation. The explanations offered have never been tested against independent data, because the raw data has never been made available. Whatever the real number turns out to be, the physical facts about Middle Eastern crude aren't disputed. The depth, the reservoir rock, the natural pressure, the chemical composition, none of that is in question. Saudi Arabia's lifting cost stayed below $10 per barrel through 2024's increases. No significant producer anywhere else is close to that. The Zagros structures, the salt seals, the Tethys limestone, none of that changes with accounting adjustments. The geology is real even when the paperwork is under challenge. Yamani's most famous line is that the Stone Age didn't end because humans ran out of stones. He meant that oil won't just burn until the last barrel is gone and then stop, but something else will change the calculation before physical depletion gets there. The electric vehicle market has already bent the global demand curve in ways that weren't expected a decade ago. Renewable energy investment passed oil and gas capital spending in several major economies by 2024. The fiscal break-even price, the price each exporting government actually needs per barrel to fund its own national budget, has in several cases now climbed above what the market reliably delivers. Bahrain needs oil above $100 a barrel to cover its spending. Saudi Arabia has needed it above 80. Kuwait and the UAE have built larger reserve funds and more diversified income, which gives them a cushion the others lack. But even they still rely on oil for the majority of what runs their governments. A geological advantage that made extraction cheap doesn't automatically produce stability when population growth, defense spending, and the rising cost of keeping social peace keep pushing the break-even number higher every decade. The drill hit limestone in 1938. The embargo hit in 1973. The bond filing landed in 2019. Each moment peeled back one more layer of the same underlying fact that a vanished ocean, a continental collision, and 150 million years of underground pressure concentrated more recoverable energy in one region than exists in all the rest of the world's confirmed reserves combined. The fields are still running, the cost advantage is still real. The reserves, however you ultimately count them, still dwarf everything else. What nobody knows, what nobody has ever been able to verify from the outside, is whether the window between extracting what's left and no longer needing most of it closes in a way that builds something real for the people who live above that limestone, or whether it only ever built things for the ones who arrived from somewhere else, understood what was down there, and spent a century making sure they stayed close to it.